Hi, it's Dr. Michael McNeil here. It's now getting into the well into November, so I've had to move upstairs into my winter office, which is the smallest, darkest, normally the coolest room in the house. But this time of year, because it's such a small room, it's so much easier to heat. So I was struggling last week in my summer office, and it was too cold in there by the end of the when if the sun wasn't out, and it was just too cold. So I finally had to come up here. Probably probably I think last year I managed to get back in the winter one, back in the summer one. I mean, probably within a couple of weeks of starting of January. It was really great. But now I'm in this one. What I wanted to talk about today was it's actually one of the subjects I'm most interested in. I think I did my whole masters on what was called Dominion theology, and that's got this interesting reputation within even the Christian world, and it's really a subject that sort of like I think sits on the boundary line between what people would think of as philosophy and what people would think of as theology. uh, so, in some ways, people might call it philosophical theology or theological philosophy or these labels, which I'm not sure are particularly useful or helpful anyway. But it's because but there is some real big, um, how can I put it? There's some real big uh, philosophical questions uh, which really flow out, I think, of this subject. Because if you uh, it if you because really you're talking about political involvement, and it's like the main philosophical question, which you're going to have regarding political involvement, I think, and is that, and in the practice of of how we govern, how we govern ourselves, and or how we allow ourselves to be governed, the real uh, philosophical question, which really stems from and our relationship to the state. Sorry, let me get that out right. Yeah, your in a sense your relation of yourself as an individual to the state and to your government, and what, and their relationship to you. This is a real. That's a real. That's got all sorts of philosophical dimensions to that. I would say, and different questions that you need to answer, because you if you it's an argument that's been held at the moment. I mean, interestingly, it came up during the if you've been I'm sort of like an avid follower of what's been going on in the US with the presidential election, and I think I've been following that quite closely for the last couple of years. What's been going on there, and in a sense the astonishing comeback of President Trump, whether you like him or not. I mean, that was just a one way or another, that was probably one of the biggest political comebacks of all time, wasn't it? Somebody who was totally, who seemed to be totally discredited, and then suddenly comes back and is re-elected president. I mean, it was just an astonishing story. But I've been following that, and when he was first elected way back, I think in 2016, there was such a uh, there was such a reaction in many ways within amongst Christians that either hated him or loathed him or sort of like rejected him, because he made all sorts of overtures, didn't he, to the evangelical community, and he had Mike Pence as his vice president for that specific purpose. I think the specific purpose, having Mike Pence there was because Mike Pence was a member of the evangelical Christian community, and he was making in a sense a pitch to them, because he saw them as I don't think it was a cynical political necessarily a cynical political action, because he saw them as an enormous voting bloc within the US. I mean, one of the issues I want to address when I do this talk is the legitimacy in principle of Christian political involvement. I think that's something I really want to sort of like dig into. Is to make a case for the legitimacy of involvement, because one of the I think one of the astonishing facts to me anyway is that in the US, it was like, I think something like 40 or 50% of evangelical Christians weren't even registered to vote. You know, and so I mean, we wouldn't, you know, the the US would, if all the Christians voted, you know, there would never be a problem with, you know, regarding, you know, establishing some sort of a program in which, you know, Christian principles were there, but moral principles are there. And so and you know, and if and there's been a very strong stream, particularly in what you might call fundamentalist sort. You know, it evolved in really crystallized within the fundamentalist movement in the early, probably from say 1910 onwards. I think probably 1914 uh, was when I think maybe the first volume of the Fundamentals came out, which was an academic expression of fundamentalism. But fundamentalism itself, it slowly, I think, evolved from the prophecy conferences in the 1870s in the US, because what began to happen was that liberalism became very strong. The influence of Darwinism became very strong. Various forms of humanism, and you had the aggressive sort of rejection of Christian principles and Christian values and Christian norms, and say in Nietzsche and some of the continental thinkers. And so many, it became, when people saw this happening. I think the first one, maybe I'm wrong here, maybe it was either 1875 or 1895. I know I did this in my I did this in detail in my master's thesis, so I will put a link to this. I think I've got a PDF of that on my blog. And those prophecy conferences were like a reaction to people considering that the world was getting darker and darker and darker and darker, and really the function of the Christian church was like they were creating, like building a Noah's Ark, and the only purpose of the Christian church was to rescue people from the impending flood, you know, when the world was going to be destroyed, and we had to withdraw and abandon and leave the apostate culture in which we find ourselves in, and just evangelize and preach to people and grab them, because the Antichrist is coming, and you know, there's going to be a one world government, and if you're and the something called the rapture doctrine began to appear. I think the first hints of it were, say, in the 1830s, and then I think there was two possible streams of which came out. Two possible origin stories regarding that doctrine, and I think one was around the 1830s, one was around I think late 1840s, and I think there's some linkage between them. Well, what I can remember, I haven't read this. I haven't read that part of my thesis for a while. When I sort of like go through the, you know, the historical events that eventually gave rise to the rapture doctrine, because one distinctive thing, it's something called, if you're interested in eschatology, which is just it's a posh name for the theory of last things or the last days, because in the Jesus often spoke about the last days. Paul spoke about the last days, and the last days actually began when Jesus ascended to heaven. So we're 2,000 years into the last days at the moment. So this what's called dispensationalism, which is which the cornerstone of dispensationalism is the rapture doctrine. You know, the idea that there's going to be a secret removal of the church. You know, the world's going to get darker and darker and darker, and then there's going to be a secret removal called the rapture of all the Christians are all just going to disappear. You know, if you've ever any familiarity with the Left Behind series, or you know, some of those films that I think I've got a series. I think it's Revelation, Apocalypse, and Judgment or something. And those three films are actually, I think, a little bit better than the what. But the Left Behind series, gosh, 20 years ago, the books and everything, they were mass sellers within the Christian market. So you can see how much of a market there was for this type of thinking, for the rapture thinking. And it was, and he had, when he had those prophecy conferences, the idea, the work was the world was getting darker and darker and darker, and more apostate, and morality was falling apart, and you had Darwinism, and you had what actually happened within, say, the academy was that there was something of a reaction initially within the academy, and you had those who were theologically conservative, and they generated this thing, under the, I think it's under the editorship of R.A. Torrey, who was a famous evangelical figure, but who was also an academic figure, and they organized what became known as the Fundamentals, which is like a 4-volume set, and then it is basically an academic set. I think one of the later volumes, if you get the full version, I think it's like an abridged version, which I would say is not worth having, but you can get the full version, which was like 3 or 4 volumes. And I think in the last volume, it's a little bit more pastoral, and you've got people giving what you would call Christian testimonies of their conversion and stuff. But basically, you've got in the first 3 volumes, you've actually got like an academic reaction to theological liberalism, which was, what was sweeping the academy at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And you had people who were very, very had excellent credentials, who were responding to some of the what seemed like this irresistible tide of theological liberalism, which was causing sort of like the denominations like the Baptists and the Presbyterians and everything, and they were basically splitting into what you might call the liberal wings and the conservative wings. And you got out of, say, in the case of the Presbyterian Church, you even had sort of like, what happened was that the Princeton, that was the great Christian university, the Ivy League university, which is still going today, and the seminary there, it split. You had the conservatives who split off and who went to form, under Machen, they formed sort of Westminster Seminary. And so you have these different, you have this sort of great splitting and separation of the conservative or the orthodox into their own colleges and their own universities, and from the liberals. And so, and alongside that, you had the almost total withdrawal of what you might call what people commonly understand as fundamentalism, because there's an enormous confusion about the term, because those 4 volumes that are called the Fundamentals is not where the term fundamentalist comes from. The term fundamentalist was actually coined by newspaper reporters, I think probably around that time, who referred to a particular form of populist preaching. And the thing was that what became known as fundamentalism, that was very, very anti-intellectual. They were also obscurantist, which is a posh word for withdrawing into your own, if you like, cultural ghetto, and you often present straw men arguments regarding your opponents, but one of the dominant characteristics of what would be called fundamentalism at that time was it was rigorously anti-intellectual, because it saw the academy going liberal and denying the truths of the scriptures. And it was just in many ways a very visceral reaction to that, and on the back of that, a rejection of what you might call the academy. But then you got, especially within Presbyterianism, with Westminster, the Westminster Theological Seminary, you nevertheless had that stream. One of the great things I think we have to give Presbyterianism credit for, Orthodox Presbyterian at least, is that is there's a great intellectual heritage which they've maintained, and some of the greatest thinking I think within the Christian community um, has come from the conservative Presbyterians, I would say. And I'm not, I've got no skin in the game there. I mean, I was in a Pentecostal church when I became a believer, and I've always been on that side of things. But especially when I was doing my masters, and uh, when I was studying Dominion theology, you realise how how wonderfully, in many ways, or how the great intellectual depth of some of the Presbyterian thinkers. And then you had the Dominion theology movement proper, which was in many ways a rediscovery of some of the early principles within the Reformation, especially within the works of, say, of Calvin, um, and his view of the law of God, uh, and so when you look at that sort of like that movement, in the 1970s, and all the work that was going on there, and how during the 90s how it began to influence the charismatic movement as well. So you had a lot of they were often invited to sort of like to do seminaries and involve some of the what would be called the more charismatic sort of like leaders. And so you had a very interesting sort of repoliticization of Christians getting re-involved within uh, within politics. This was particularly, I think, seen within the US. I would love to say that that's happened in in, in Europe. As myself as a British, as a British person, I would love to say that we've seen that, but I would say that it's been very much a minority position. You just don't, the level of political discourse and their one thing that struck me was, I think it was 2010 when David Cameron was our prime minister. He's interestingly has just re-entered a couple of years ago back into mainstream politics within the Conservative Party, which was interesting. But one thing that really struck me was that when he spoke about the church, it was like he was he was sort. I wouldn't say he was making fun of it, but he was just saying how totally irrelevant it was, and he was just saying, he was almost saying, I really wish the church was more serious and more relevant, because I don't want to tell the church what to do. Why should I be telling the church what to do? It was like they're so far behind the curve in many ways. There wasn't that great, although there was some, there wasn't the great change that went on, I think, during the 1970s. And then, I think it was President Carter in the US who was the first one to really try to bring faith right into the center of the political discussion. And I think then you had Ronald Reagan, and you had the Bush dynasty, and they always appealed in some way to the Christian voting bloc. And then I think you saw it most obviously with Donald Trump, who opened up the White House and got an evangelical council, and he really tried to connect with that bloc. Now, some people consider that as cynical, but I think that anybody who's been close to Donald Trump regarding that, I think is it I think it's Paula White who's his spiritual advisor, and I've recently watched stuff from her, and or heard discussions that are going on, and some of the discussions that they had with President Trump, that it wasn't just the issues which were important. He was genuinely interested and concerned and wanted to hear, what does the Christian community think about this. So I don't think some people get very cynical, don't they? Said, oh, and there was a lot of that going on during the 2000s of presidents just giving lip service at election time, trying to get the votes. And even President Obama, when he was running in 2008, he appealed to the black evangelicals and said that marriage should be between a man and a woman. But as soon as he got in power, they abandoned that. But the idea was to get the black evangelical vote. So, but you can see this. So one of the things I want to do, I suppose, with this talk is to make the case in principle that Christians should be involved, and then specifically, I'll probably, I should imagine this will go on onto a part two, but then to look at Romans 13, which, if you like, is the locus classicus of that whole argument of how do Christians view the state, or now what's our attitude to the state? Because I think if we bring this right back to excuse me, I think it's become very, very much in focus again. How do we view the state? I think I just remembered what I was going to say about 20 minutes ago. I think one of the reasons why this is such a big question in your basic view of the state is, and it actually happened when I was talking about the American presidential election so I think somebody created like a film which I think was released, maybe it was released earlier this year, and it was basically like one of these hatchet job sort of films that were basically trying to talk about the Christian nationalists who were supporting Trump, and basically labeling them as domestic extremists, and and they had this sort of like idea of theocracy, and it was a real, I think one of the co-producers of the film, they showed, because there was two people who were real drivers behind, and one of them was a bit like a Southern Baptist, who was a never Trumper Southern Baptist or something, and then the other person, the other producer of the film, and I can remember seeing them in this discussion, and the one who was the Southern Baptist was talking about, oh, we honor our God, but the problem was his co-producer was like an atheist, is known as an atheist. It's like it was one of these farcical sort of situations, but it showed how faith was the relationship of faith and the Christian's view of the state and the Christian's relation to government. They're very, very important questions, and I think somebody in discussing that film actually, and when they were discussing the reaction to the film as well, they were discussing the reaction in so-called conservative Christian circles to this film, and they were saying that some people were scandalized because it was saying that our rights don't come from the government, they come from God. And that is one of the fundamental philosophical questions there, is where do our rights actually come from? Because if our rights come from the government, then the government giveth and the government taketh away. Okay, the government is the final authority. So if in whatever form of humanism it is, that's a non-religious sort of form of humanism. I mean, there are religious forms of humanism. We have to acknowledge that there are Christian humanists there, and they're probably humanists of other religions as well. But when your fundamental question that you need to ask, and this is one of the key questions there, is where do our rights actually come from? If they are granted, but that's one of the reasons why the American founders framed the Constitution in the way that they did, and they actually said that we consider these rights, these rights come from God. They don't come from the government, and all the Constitution is doing is recognizing those rights that have been given to us by God. And that's one of the reasons why the American Constitution is such a powerful document. And it's one of the reasons why globalists have been working so hard to try and undermine the Constitution and to get rid of the American Constitution, because it's standing as a roadblock in the way of their great globalist utopian vision. So these are not abstract questions, that we're dealing with here. These are really your relationship as a believer or as a Christian to the state is a really important issue. So obviously I'm coming at this from an issue of, say, Christian philosophy. Some of my other discussion of my work and my thesis has been more generally philosophical, and but I do hope that this has nevertheless got some enough of interest to somebody who's not necessarily coming at this from as a Christian or as a believer, but would like to understand how get some sort of understanding of how would Christians, how would people of faith deal with this issue. And I think I would encourage you to carry on watching if you've somehow just come across this and you're thinking, oh, is this just going to be somebody talking about Christianity? No, I'm talking about the relationship of what is our relationship to the state, what is our view of the state, and then consider in detail say Romans 13, because if there's ever been one piece of scripture that's been more misunderstood, and I believe it's still very misunderstood in vast swathes of the Christian consciousness, is Romans 13, because it became a real issue during COVID, because one of the attacks against, say, Christians or against, people of faith that, belong to the Christian tradition, who were questioning whether or not, lockdowns were legitimate, or it does the was there one of the reactions that were made was that people were saying, well, Romans 13 tells us to be that all authorities come from God, and for us to obey and to be in submission to the authorities. So so if we'll do a proper reading of Romans 13 to describe it on a surface reading of Romans 13 would very much allow that sort of interpretation. Yet it's one of the pieces of scripture where you really need some sort of interpretive context to it, and you have to have, say, like a hermeneutical framework to really understand what it is. But if you just read it on the surface and you don't dig into it, you can get that impression, oh, it's just saying we Christians should always obey the government. And so, if you like, as a preview, I'm going to say that is not true. Christians do not always have to obey their government. There's strict principles within Romans 13 and a structure there that shows you when a state is legitimate or when it's not legitimate, because we can accept without contradiction that that all authorities come from God, all governments, all states are instituted by God, and God creates those and God puts those in place. We can accept that as a principle, but we can deny that a particular instantiation of that principle, as seen in different governments around the world, are legitimate governments. And if those that call themselves states and call themselves governments constitute and arrogate to themselves beyond the definition that's found in Romans 13, then we as believers are not obligated to obey and to be in submission to those, because they've delegitimized themselves. So that's if you like, and in the extreme case, I'll be arguing that a Christian is perfectly within their rights as a citizen to join in even a revolution to overthrow a corrupt state. So that's, if you like, giving you a little bit of an overview of some of the issues we'll be talking about. And because I felt very much that I needed to address this issue because I was involved a few years ago in a what you might call I was going through a training course, and somehow there was sessions on. I'm not sure how it fitted in. There was a session on, say, on. It was the start of, I think of COVID, and so everything was online, and there was quite a reaction. And I'd written quite a lot of stuff regarding Romans 13 and what I viewed as tyranny of the government, locking people down and taking away their rights in the name of a public health emergency. And I mean, it's very interesting now because all those actions, and even at the time it was questionable and there was challenges, but it was like though the in the UK we had something called the the Coronavirus Act or something, and it basically stripped people of their rights to assemble, their rights to go outside, and it but the legislation itself was illegitimate, and so everybody who was prosecuted or who was fined under that legislation was lately their convictions were quashed, and they were and the damages were paid to them. And so that's an excellent example of a because within sense we don't have a written constitution like the US does, sort of. We do have though something called the law of land, which is called the Magna Carta, which was something that was, I think, 10th, 11th century, maybe even 12th century, and it was a reaction against the political tyranny of the kings, who said we are ordained of God, and it was the divine right of kings, it was called. And so within this was established some fundamental principles which are really the British Constitution, if you like, and the right of somebody to basically live as they please, provide as long as they're not criminal, and to freely assemble and to freely labor, and very much the inspiration of what went into the Puritans as they went to the US. And but our, if you like, our system of jurisprudence, there was, if you're in, say, a court in the UK, they'll refer to things like the dock, the bar, and if you know anything about it, you'll actually know that those are terms which are to do with being a mariner, being sort of maritime law. And so it's called the law of the sea, because we already have the law of the land, which is called the Magna Carta, but there's been this big sleight of hand by the legal profession, and that has obscured our rights underneath this enormous blanket of legislation. And so whereas we haven't got that sort of like that guarantee of, say, the constitutional rights that you might have, say, in the US or other constitutional republics, but we've got this, but instead we had this Magna Carta that's been obscured because of the way our legal system has grown up over the last 800-900 years. And so a lot of the fundamental rights which we've got, because it doesn't matter what a government, what law or an act of parliament or something that a government passes, if it's fundamentally incompatible with these basic principles. You find this, I think, in the US, don't you, when they just had this enormous ruling, I think, with regards to it was called, I think it was, what's the doctrine called, but I can't remember the specific name of the doctrine, but it's like, if, say, the American Congress passes an act, a government agency interprets that act and comes up with all its regulations, and there was I think it was called something doctrine, which basically meant that if you tried to challenge that, as if you were as a private individual, or as a group, or for whatever reason you wanted to challenge what a government agency, how the government agency had interpreted the act, and actually said that the way they've interpreted that act was against the spirit of the act or something like that. But there was a doctrine that was established that said that the courts always had to defer to the government agency, which is what created the great bureaucratic state, the great administrative, some people call the deep state, the great administrative state. But there's been a very significant ruling, I think, in the last few months in the US, which basically says that whole doctrine, that whole assumption that the government agency, their interpretation of any particular act is the correct one, that's being overruled, I think, by the Supreme Court. So that basically means that this enormous bureaucracy that's grown up, that's basically, in a sense, tyrannized over vast swathes of the business and people. I think in some states it's, say, I read in New York that I think you had to go through some astonishing. If you say you want to open up a fast food place or something, a burger place or something, if you wanted to do it legally, like legitimately, the number of permits that you have to get and all the competing, it's astonishing. It's absolutely amazing. And that's one of the reasons why when you saw with the legal assault on President Trump and the all the different activities of of the state. And so these are not just sort of abstract issues. These are real issues that we need to have some sort of view as a Christian, as a Christian community. And obviously I'm speaking as a Christian, so the idea of the legitimacy of engagement and the importance of engagement, the moral case for engagement, all these things I think are very, very important, because we were basically tyrannized over by our governments in the last few years. And even and when you consider sort of like the case that if you're going to just accept that surface reading of Romans 13, then what are you going to say the apartheid, the church leaders who were dealing with apartheid? You would say that that they were their opposition to apartheid was illegitimate, because because the government, the South African government, would regularly quote to the church leaders who were who were opposing, the government with apartheid, will fight against it. We all know Bishop Tutu, don't we? He won a Nobel Peace Prize, and one of the criticisms labelled at him by the apartheid government was that Romans 13 tells you that you should be in submission to the governing powers, and your opposition to us is illegitimate. And that's, and the idea that that we should, that we can't oppose, say, that if you were, say, a Christian living in sort of Nazi Germany, or living under Mussolini's Italy, or in these various, pick any place around the world where where it's a tyrannical government that's oppressing you. Are you trying, are we actually really saying that the only opposition that we can have in those such situations is some sort of weak passive opposition to it? Because that's what I was on this convocation, and these matters were being discussed, and the leader, who who's somebody I very, very much respect. I would, in other, I think I consider them as one of the, I think prime thinkers within what you might call, what's it called? I think I'm trying to think of how it's self-identified. I think the prophetic movement, maybe. It's probably maybe the best way of describing it. And they're one of the the principal British leaders within that movement. And there's somebody on most topics. I really value what they say, but when this was being discussed, and the push and some of the arguments that were being made, and there is like a little book that I think that was brought out this year, which I will put in the description, which presents this point of view that was presented at the convocation, really, which is very much an agnostic view. I think I would call it like a politically agnostic view, where you're saying that that the form of government's not important, that there's nothing more nothing more desirable than, they say, from God's point of view, of a democracy or a monarchy, or or if it's a strong man, sort of like authoritarian government. It was almost like saying that that God's going to work through whatever government there is, and that there's no preference expressed within Scripture for any form of government. And so it was a very much what I would call a politically agnostic view, and also but the whole implications of that view, and I think the way it was argued, I reacted very strongly against it. I must admit, I really, I think I listened to it once and I thought, gosh, I'm not sure that I completely got what the argument was that was being talked about, because I was on the call, but I was just thinking, wait a minute, I'm reacting very strongly against this, because I think it was talking about how how we should react to being locked down, uh, and and are not being able to sort of like go outside and be told we can only go outside for an hour a day, and and it was really sort of like making the case that the right Christian attitude to these sort of things is to just accept, and that didn't sit well with me for whatever reason. I'd already written a few articles about that where I saw it was tyranny, because I felt that it was empirically false, the arguments that were being used from the point of view that justified the lockdown that the government was using. There was no empirical evidence. The way they used the evidence, they weren't being honest with the evidence. They weren't being honest with the medical evidence. You can look through I ended up doing quite an extended study in it, where I took 3 months out almost from doing my doctorate, and just did all this research, because there was something with it that just didn't sit right with me. And you can look at all the you can look at the UN reports, and you can look at all the different you could basically look at all the stats and the science to me, how many people were dying of respiratory diseases, how many people were dying of COVID, and you could do this. And I said, well, this is just illegitimate. The way the government has used and presented the evidence is illegitimate. And so how can you say that we should be, our moral responsibility is to obey these dishonest government ministers, and who obviously had some other agenda that was driving them and pushing them. And so that I reacted very strongly to, because I was on the call and I thought, is that really? So I listened to it again and I listened to it again, and I thought, no, I haven't actually misunderstood what they're going on about, and they really actually believe that this is legitimate. And like I say, I will. This is not a personal criticism of that person, because I still respect that person very much, and I enjoy their ministry, and I received an enormous amount from my time where I was there. And so it's not it's not a criticism, but I'm just trying to push the conversation on, because when I was just doing my own research around this issue of how does the Christian react to the state, what's our relationship to the state, I'd already read what I consider probably one of the finest expositions of Romans 13 that I've ever read, and that's actually by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. And he was a famous evangelical preacher from the 1970s, who, in fact, I think he retired in the 70s. I think he died at the end of the 70s, but he was at Westminster Chapel from, I think, the mid 1940s. I think he was trained as a physician in the 30s, and in fact, I think yes, because I think there was occasionally where he's talking about the First World War and stuff as well as, but he was very well known as as an famous evangelical preacher in Westminster. It's called Westminster Chapel in London, and it was also connected with. He was also an expert on the Puritans, when obviously the Puritans left Europe and founded the US, and you've got all the Puritan input into the early American colonies and the founding of the Constitution. And so so this guy's not like a crazy guy, but he's not somebody that's on the fringes. He's not like a Christian revolution anarchist or something. This is a straight down the line evangelical preacher, and his discussion of Romans 13, which I'd already read, I think, before I was involved on this call. And so he makes the case that Christians can be involved in rebellion, they can be involved in in a revolution, and he basically establishes the very well. I mean, there were points of difference which I discuss in my thesis. I think some of his assumptions that he was talking about of the, if you like, what we might call the Judeo-Christian assumptions of our country. I would say some of those assumptions that he was saying we can assume this. I said, well, you can't assume that anymore, and there are differences. And what if the platform of your political party? Because the one of the discussions that he has is where he talks about you can have equally good Christians saying we have three main parties um, in the UK. There's a little bit of a fragmentation now, but really we've got two big parties. One of the big parties, which our left-wing party is called the Labour Party, the right-wing party is called the Conservative Party. And at one time in the early 20th century, the Labour Party split off from what was called the old Liberal Party, which was like 19th century Victorian, European liberalism. And that split really, and then you had what was left, the old Liberal Party. Now we had the Social Democratic sort of like party, but really there's two big parties, and you've got like a host of smaller little parties. And but really, our politics is very polarized in many ways, and the two main parties, because of the way our voting system works as well, is that it amplifies the vote of, so even if we can even have, I think it's amazing, our last general election, the Labour Party has got something like, I think it ended up with 2/3 of our seats in Parliament, but it only got 30% of the vote because it concentrated on the big urban areas where there were lots of seats, and they're very smart. I think they must have learned this from the Democratic Party in the US, I think. But they were very smart. They just targeted getting the urban areas, and they managed to amplify their vote and got themselves into a very powerful position within Parliament. So we can see that, in the sense, in what's gone on. These are how we react and our relationship to the state. And I found that Dr. Martyn Lloyd-Jones is sort of like exposition of that. I'd heard this, and then I went into this convocation, and I thought, and I thought, well, this is totally, the idea that the only resistance you can have is some sort of weak, passive resistance in the background. I found, that I found it so difficult to actually think. I don't understand this, because normally the ministry of this of this person, and of the movement that's that they're an integral part of, and an important part of, it's normally really, really sharp, and it's normally, and I was just amazed that our knowledge as believers was so low on this issue. So that's one of the reasons what motivated me, in the sense, during the masters, and to put it as part of my doctorate as well. The final chapters, really, I'm talking about political involvement, just the importance of political involvement, the history of political involvement of different groups who've been involved, and how historically, there's key features within the evangelical movement, and within the revivalist movement, and within the Reformation tradition. They understood the importance of political involvement and the imperative of political involvement. And so that's really what this, giving like a little bit of a preview of what I'm going to be talking about. That's how important this is, because if you don't have a proper concept of the state, and of the legitimate boundaries of the state, and of the function of the state, what's happened, and this has happened in our, you cannot see anything clearer that's happened within the last couple of 100 years within the states of Europe, and all around, and around the world. And what's happened in in the US is that states have become more and more intrusive. They've become larger and larger and larger. They've appropriated more and more power to themselves. And when there's been these great crises, like the COVID pandemic was an exceptional example of this. They appropriated so much power to themselves, and so much money and wealth and influence to themselves, and private companies. And if you think about the finest Pfizer's and the Modernas, and they more money than we could dream of they made, and at the expense of destroying small and medium businesses. How many local small shops closed during that period, and how many we had big Amazon warehouses that were springing up when other people weren't even allowed to go outside. I thought, well, how does that work? How can you have a big Amazon warehouse being built, but the little paper shop around the corner is not allowed to open? Things like that really, really, they, people that, in a sense, a lot of those small little small businesses, mum, they'll call them like mama and papa, grocery stores and stuff. That's a US term, isn't it? The mama and papa. But when you've got like a small local store like that, and suddenly people found their pensions completely wiped out. There were a few years, they'd been there 20, 30 years as a shop, going to retire within the next 10 years. Suddenly they weren't allowed to open. All the stuff was wiped out. And who gained? Transnational globalist institutions, they gained. And big global companies gained, who got very sophisticated tax arrangement stuff. They're like, for us, they're headquartered in Ireland. They do their EU business in EU and stuff. They got some funny sort of tax relief. There's this argument going on, and they basically end up paying no tax and making vast quantities of cash. Smart. They work the tax codes, and they work. So, to just sort of think of these without not considering these issues, I think we do a massive disservice, both as, say, philosophers and as Christians. We need to have some clear understanding of what's going on and how, and the importance of sorting these thinking these issues through. So I think I'll sort of like stop here and pause here. But I've tried to give a little bit of feel of some other things I'm going to dig in more detail, because to me this is a really important issue. This is a very practical thing, and this is one of my views regarding one of my fundamental principles. I think regarding philosophy is that philosophy should be have practical implications, and you can work out your philosophy pragmatic. I'm not a pragmatist in the formal sense, but I do believe that the implications of philosophy is not just about making a problem clear, say, what might be called the therapeutic conception of philosophy, but it's also about solving the problems, and that there should be practical implications, what's going on, of how what are the outworkings, what practical outworkings come from our philosophy. Okay, so I'm just been busy testing out this mic. So this little wireless mic here, got this on there to hopefully improve the audio quality. So I think apparently I can get 6 hours out of it. So hopefully the audio quality is better on these videos now. But I'll pause there for now, and we will get on. I'll talk a little bit more, I think, in detail about why Christians should be involved, and then we'll move on to Romans 13. Okay, thank you very much.